Everyone knows why the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead. It is one of the first facts we learn in primary school, a truth so established it rarely invites question. They did it to preserve the body for eternity. For years, I walked through the quiet halls of museums, staring into the glass cases at those linen-wrapped forms, and I told myself the same simple story. I believed that the Egyptians were terrified of decay and oblivion, so they invented a complex science to freeze themselves in time. It makes perfect intuitive sense to us, doesn't it? We look at our own mortality, and we assume they were just like us, desperate to hold on to life, only with better access to natron and resin. We assume that the ultimate goal was to keep the corpse looking as much like the living person as possible, indefinitely. And let's be honest, the physical evidence for this view seems overwhelming. When you look at the face of Seti I or Ramesses the Great, you are looking at men who died over 3,000 years ago, yet you can still recognize the bridge of a nose, the texture of hair, and the curve of a lip. The results seem to speak for themselves. We see the elaborate canopic jars designed to hold vital organs, the hundreds of yards of linen bandages, and the thick coatings of black resin. And we interpret this as a desperate practical attempt to halt the natural process of decomposition. We think of mummification as a technical triumph, a primitive form of cryogenics designed to ensure the soul had a physical house to return to. If the body rotted away, the soul would be lost. That is the dogma we have accepted. It implies that the Egyptians were obsessed with the material, physical retention of the flesh as it was in life. I believed this interpretation because it is what every documentary and guidebook told me. I looked at the perfectly preserved bodies and applauded their success. But then I actually started reading the texts. I began to look at what the Egyptian priests themselves wrote about the rituals they performed in the embalming tents. And that is when the ground shifted beneath my feet. Because when you strip away our modern assumptions and listen to their voices, a startling contradiction emerges. The Egyptians were not stupid. They knew that a dried, blackened, dehydrated husk didn't look anything like a living, breathing person. I realized that we have been looking at the result, the survival of the body, and mistaking it for the intent. But when you read what the Egyptians actually wrote about mummification, preservation was never the point. But as I dug deeper into the actual texts left behind, particularly the Book of the Dead and the pyramid texts, something simply didn't add up. The standard explanation we are all taught in school, that mummification was just a desperate primitive attempt to freeze a body in time, started to crumble before my eyes. I found myself staring at a specific linguistic detail that completely contradicts the idea of simple preservation, a detail that most of us overlook entirely. In these sacred texts, the deceased are almost never referred to simply by their own earthly names. You don't see prayers just for the scribe Ani or the king Teti. Instead, the text creates a new, compound identity. They are referred to as Osiris Ani or Osiris Teti. At first, I thought this might just be a polite honorific, like calling someone saint. But the grammar suggests something far more radical. The deceased hasn't just joined the god, they have become the god. This realization hit me hard. If the goal was simply to preserve Ani the man as he looked in life, why change his fundamental identity? The answer forces us to look at the very first mummy in Egyptian history. It wasn't a human, it was a god. According to the foundational myth, Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Seth. It was Isis who gathered those scattered limbs and bound them together with linen and resin to resurrect him. This is the key that unlocks the mystery. The mummification workshops weren't functioning as ancient morgues or medical facilities. They were operating as temples dedicated to reenacting this specific divine drama. The more I looked at the process, the more the preservation theory fell apart. If the Egyptians only wanted to stop decay, there were faster, cheaper, and less invasive ways to dry a body. But they didn't choose efficiency. They chose to follow the exact ritual steps attributed to Isis. Why would they do that unless the physical outcome was secondary to the ritual intent? This builds a massive amount of cognitive dissonance for us as modern viewers. We look at a mummy and see a dried-out human corpse. But the Egyptians looked at the same object and saw a divine statue. The process wasn't about keeping the person as they were. It was a transfiguration. Every layer of linen was applied not to keep the air out, but to weave the deceased into the body of Osiris himself. The mummy wasn't a portrait of the human who died. It was a construction of the god they were becoming. As I peeled back the layers of history, much like the archaeologists who first unwrapped these bodies, I realized we had been asking the wrong question entirely. We kept asking how they preserved the flesh, obsessing over natron salts and brain hooks. But the real question, the one that unlocks the entire mystery, is who they were trying to create. The answer lies in the most famous murder mystery in Egyptian mythology, a story that would eventually eclipse even the stellar cults of the pyramid builders to become the heart of Egyptian religion. To understand the mummy, I had to understand the victim, Osiris. The myth tells us that Osiris was a benevolent king of Egypt until his jealous brother Set murdered him. But Set didn't just kill him, he wanted to erase him. He hacked Osiris's body into pieces, some texts say 14, others 42, corresponding to the districts of Egypt, and scattered them across the land. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy to the very instruction manual for mummification. Isis, the wife of Osiris, didn't just bury what was left. She spent years scouring the Nile Delta, recovering every severed limb and fragment. When she had them all, she didn't just stitch them together, she bound them tight. She used magical wrappings to reconstitute the scattered form of her husband, creating a singular unified whole from the chaos of dismemberment. This was the first mummy. The bandages weren't about hygiene, they were about integrity. They were the magic that held the god together. When I looked at the actual rituals performed in the embalming workshops, the connection became undeniable. The embalmers weren't acting as doctors trying to cure death. They were actors in a cosmic play. They were ritually reenacting what Isis did for Osiris. Every step of the 70-day process was scripted. Why 70 days? Because that was the period the star Sirius disappeared from the sky before rising again. A celestial mirror of Osiris's time in the underworld. The priests, often wearing the mask of Anubis, wrapped the body in specific patterns, not to keep the air out, but to create a cocoon of divinity. They were turning the deceased human into a statue of the god. This culminates in the opening of the mouth ceremony. I found descriptions of priests using a ritual adze, a woodworking tool, to touch the mouth of the mummy. This wasn't symbolic. They believed this magic literally restored the senses, allowing the dead to speak, eat, and breathe again, not as a reanimated corpse, but as an indestructible spirit. The smoking gun, however, isn't found on the bodies, but on the walls surrounding them. I started reading the translations of the pyramid texts, carved as far back as 2350 BCE, and the later coffin texts. The language stopped me in my tracks. It doesn't speak of the dead sleeping or resting. The texts scream defiance against mortality. In the Pyramid of King Unes, the glyphs declare, "You have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive." But as I moved to the later spells, specifically from the Book of the Dead, I noticed a grammatical shift that changes everything. The spells don't just pray to Osiris, they address the deceased as Osiris. If a man named Ani died, the texts wouldn't refer to him as the soul of Ani. They called him Osiris Ani. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a transubstantiation. By wrapping the body like Osiris and reciting the spells of Isis, the deceased became the god. The mummy was the chrysalis for this metamorphosis. This revelation led me to what I think is the most profound evolution in Egyptian history. In the Old Kingdom, this specific ritual transformation was the jealously guarded privilege of the king. Only the pharaoh possessed the specific spells to command the cosmos and become Osiris. Civil war and social upheaval changed the landscape, and in the ashes, a new possibility took root: the extension of royal privileges to the wider elite. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, the royal path to divinity was opened to others. It was the scribe, the merchant, the wealthy farmer, anyone who could afford the wrappings and the rituals. Egypt popularized the idea that the human soul had divine potential. You didn't have to be born a king to rule in the next world. You just had to be made into an Osiris upon your death. As I stood back and looked at this entire process, the murder, the reassembly, the ritual, and the text, I felt a shiver of recognition. We tend to think of the Egyptian religion as a dead thing buried in the sand. But look closer. Here we have a god who dies effectively as a human, is mourned by women, is resurrected to eternal life and becomes the judge of the dead. Every soul must face judgment before him to gain everlasting paradise. This pattern was established in Egypt 2,500 years before Christianity. The obsession with the body wasn't a fear of rot. It was a desperate, beautiful engineering project to ensure that the vessel was ready for the resurrection. They mummified their dead because they believed that with the right ritual, the human could transcend humanity. They weren't trying to pause death, they were building a machine to conquer it. Everything I had learned, every strange ritual and chemical analysis we've discussed so far, finally pointed to one singular, earth-shattering conclusion. For years we have looked at these bodies and asked, how did they fail? We look at the shriveled skin and the blackened bones, and think the Egyptians were bad at taxidermy, or that they were naively trying to freeze a moment in time. But standing there, staring at the hieroglyphs painting the inside of that sarcophagus, the pieces suddenly snapped into place. We have been asking the wrong question entirely. I finally understood that the Egyptians weren't trying to keep the body as it was. They were actively trying to change it. This wasn't preservation. This was transformation. The resin, the linen, the oils, they weren't preservatives meant to keep a human looking human. They were the ingredients of a divine alchemy. The Egyptians believed that human flesh was fallible and temporary, but gold was the flesh of the gods. When they covered a body in that black, tar-like resin, they weren't just sealing it against moisture. They were coating the deceased in the colors of regeneration, literally turning them into a statue, an image of eternity. This is the revelation that reframes everything. The goal wasn't to remember the dead person. The goal was to cure them of being human. The mummy, in its ideal ritual form, is not a preserved corpse. It is a person who has successfully been transfigured into a god, usually Osiris, or in later periods, identified with Hathor. In their theology, you didn't just meet the god of the dead, you became him. By mirroring the way the gods were made, imperishable gold skin, hair of lapis lazuli, wrapped in the white linen of purity, they believed they could hack the laws of the universe. It is perhaps the most audacious idea in human history. This was humanity's first systematic answer to the terror of death. They didn't say, "We will remember you." They said, "We will make you divine." They looked at the inevitability of decay and decided to engineer a way out of it, not by holding on to the past, but by manufacturing a new future. They mummified bodies to create gods. And once you see it that way, you realize we aren't looking at a graveyard. We are looking at a pantheon of ordinary people who refuse to simply fade away. When I finally understood that mummification was a transfiguration ritual, not just a preservation technique, the entire map of human belief shifted for me. We often look at the ancient Egyptians as isolated, a strange culture obsessed with death, but as I traced the lineage of these rituals, I realized they were actually the inventors of eternal life. Consider the pattern we have uncovered here: a God who suffers and dies, a period of darkness and transformation, and a glorious resurrection into a new form of existence. Does that sound familiar? It should. The structural DNA of the Osirian myth didn't vanish under the desert sands. It migrated. It strikes me that the Egyptians were the first to truly articulate the refusal to end. Their theology echoed into the Levant, influencing the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually the foundations of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Hasabli. What if our entire concept of an afterlife of a soul that outlasts the body, faces judgment and enters paradise, traces back to this one murdered god in the Nile Valley? The implication is staggering. It suggests that for over 5,000 years, humanity has been telling itself the same essential story to keep the dark at bay. We have always been terrified of the void, and Osiris was our first coherent answer to it. This is why this matters to you, sitting here today. Whether you are religious, spiritual, or strictly secular, you are part of a species that has consistently refused to accept death as the final word. We are the only creatures who build monuments to memory. The Egyptians didn't just want to stop the body from rotting, they wanted to engineer a mechanism for the soul to travel, and that desire is still the engine of our culture. Every time we hope for a legacy, every time we tell a story to keep a loved one alive, we are performing a mental version of these ancient rites. Sirius duffel def a minusult and af in day key. Sirius del need li a ever mytho or vricam. Subscribe to keep exploring ancient wisdom. See the first desperate, beautiful attempt by humanity to defeat time itself. We are still wrapping ourselves in hope, still waiting to become Ak, still waiting to shine. The bandages may have crumbled, but the idea never died. It just changed its name. This is Ego O Mytho Arvikam. Subscribe to keep exploring ancient